Okay, hi, I'm Chivonne Algeo, the Program Director of the Monash's Master of Project Management Program. And welcome to this, our first in a series of conversations with industry leaders. I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land we are gathered today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Today our panel will talk about strategic business outcomes and whether they are accelerated or slowed down by project delivery. We'll hear from Luke Belfield, the Director of Asset Strategy and Projects in the Department of Treasury and Finance, Peter Munro, the General Manager for Infrastructure at Metro Trains, Pelagia Markogiannakis, the Director of Project Controls for the Major Roads Projects Authority, and my colleague in the Monash Business School, Richard Foster, who is the Chief Examiner and Unit Coordinator for Consulting Projects. And Richard will be helping me out today with the conversation. If you've got any questions for the panel, please submit them through the Q&A function, and we'll also share a recording of the session via a link after the presentation. So to get started, I'm going to ask Pella, how do you build resilience into the assets that you deliver, especially in the light of the recent disruptions?
Thanks, Chivonne. Well, firstly, you have to make sure your risk registers are correct. The fundamental requirements for project management don't get set aside just because we're in a pandemic. We had really good, robust risk registers for most of the assets that we're building. When we started to see an emergence of a potential risk, we added it to the risk registers. Once that risk was confirmed, validated, come to the fore, becomes an issue. Once it's an issue, it goes into the issues registers. Then it goes into the change registers, and eventually when claims come in from the contractors to support their activities for the pandemic, in this particular case, then those are assessed, and they're assessed against the criteria that are set down for most claims. So we have those risks assigned, and each one of them has a cost against them, and then we validate against the cost. So that's the standard practice for any risk situation and risk management process in any of the assets we deliver. And sometimes the risks come about and that's how they go, and sometimes the risks don't come about, and so we retire them and reallocate risk allocations depending on if there are additional risks we have not had money to actually put against for them. So it's very simple, and you keep it simple as possible. Hopefully that helps with the understanding of how we put in place things that we are foreseeable, but not necessarily unknown.
What about you? Or Richard?
Can I just jump in there? Pella, things have changed a bit in the last few weeks or months. How has that impacted your risk registers now?
So we're actually trying to get a more coherent, consistent way of approaching the contractors' claims for the COVID environment, if you like. Most of our contractors get extensions of times according to their terms and conditions quite easily. However, if there are additional costs, in this case there have been, additional sanitisation, more crib space for the staff, more shifts so that you can still get the amount of work done, but with less people on site at any one time. So there's a whole bunch of activities that everyone's put in place to actually meet the requirements. So the intention is to have a more holistic view. So everyone is working really well together. Everyone knew this was coming. Everyone's cooperating and collaborating, which is wonderful. And my experience has been that when you have a crisis or a disruption like this, most people want to work together and want to do the right thing. So it's not a big deal.
I just also like to add to that, working in Treasury and Finance, we sort of take the whole of Victoria perspective, and something that we're very quick to do is organise a forum in the virtual space, of course, where all the different delivery agencies and departments can discuss what they're actually facing on a day-to-day basis. And so you can get that consistency across government in the response and have a consistent way forward in terms of, if this pandemic gets worse or if it scales back, what do we focus on? So, what are our priorities in terms of addressing this response? So thinking through things like let's focus all of our efforts into the health sector to make sure that we've got enough ICU beds and ventilators to make sure that that the population can actually deal with this crisis. And then thinking about, well, how do we keep our projects economy keep on going? So how do we keep projects ticking along and making sure that people are still employed and that you're not seeing that huge economic drop off in Victoria? And really thinking about, well, this is a resilience episode. It's an acute event. So how can we think about this in terms of that mind frame and really make sure our projects are robust to be able to deal with this situation, but also thinking how to help Victoria get through this situation as well.
What about you, Peter? Has there been a similar experience in your part of the world?
Yeah, look, it certainly has. I think one of the phrases that we sort of talk about a lot at Metro is that we're in a period where we're building a railway at the same time while we're running a railway. So during a period that we're in at the moment, we've got a really critical role to play for the people of Melbourne to make sure that critical workers or people who need to get to healthcare facilities can still get around Melbourne as they need to. So we've been very cognizant of how do we ensure the stability of our ongoing operation. So we've had to put lots of additional precautions in place that we didn't have before to make sure the most vulnerable parts of our organisation are protected from outbreaks of virus. I mean, certainly only in the media a couple of days ago, we had our first experience with a positive case at Flinders Street. And certainly that really tested some of our risk management approaches to make sure that we did have the right controls in place to make sure that we didn't see a wide-scale outbreak in our workforce and we could keep Melbourne moving, but also that the thousands of people that pass through that station each day aren't put at risk either. The other big thing, I suppose, on the project side of things is while we are still building a railway, it's incredibly important that we can keep pushing ahead with the agenda to expand the capacity of transport in Melbourne and in Victoria. And we certainly can't slow down the pace even at a difficult time like this. So the kinds of risks that we've been thinking a lot about are the kind of work that we tend to do where we might shut the railway for a weekend or a week, or for example, on the Frankston line at the moment, we've got a 60-day closure. One of the biggest risks that we think about at the moment is if we're going to start that work, when we cut the track and pull down all the overhead wires and demolish a station, in 60 days, whether there's a virus or not, people expect that there's going to be a train running again in 60 days' time. So we can't sort of find ourselves in situations where we have unmitigated risks, especially that eventuate from viruses where we don't have a railway running again when we say we're going to do, because people really rely on that. So some of the risk management plans we have in place there, some of the contingencies that we would normally run with, we're finding now that the second layer of control and the third contingency and the fourth contingency are being thought about, because the likelihood of your contingencies failing, I suppose, when they otherwise wouldn't in a time like this is really something that we're thinking a lot about and taking quite seriously.
Yeah, just on that, Peter, and extending that through into what you were talking about, and also with Luke and Pella and Richard, all of you saying about all of this seems to rely on the common denominator of the people that you're relying on to actually deliver the work. How do you create that culture where those conversations that are critical to the success of the actual project outcomes can occur?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting sort of area to explore, I think, Chivonne. Look, certainly in the virus space, I think that there's lots of new conversations that we've found we're having, which we weren't having before. And I think that they'll be really valuable things that we're looking now into how do we keep those as part of our business as usual once we get to the other side of this, whenever that does occur. We're finding the depth that we're really diving into within the organisation, the layers of workforce that we're able to have really high quality conversations with is like never before. Basic things like the conversations we have with our health and safety reps are just incredibly productive at the moment, where there's a really good sense of purpose and drive towards what the outcome is. And we're finding we can really have some high quality conversations that perhaps are more challenging than in the past. Likewise, that's the running the railway part for us. And I think when we think about building the railway, we operate in a really complex stakeholder environment within Victoria with a number of different building authorities, along with operators and government players involved in that element of it. So for us, making sure that we remain aligned on what we're here to do and what the priorities are, especially as things are changing, has become a really important thing for us to do. So the disciplines from things I care a lot about, making sure that the railway will continue to run, the operational readiness disciplines have become really important, and making sure that we're really tied in closely with all of the different players in the industry to make sure that we remain aligned has been really important for us. These are the kinds of things that we all have contracts in place, and we've all got things that we're signed up to deliver. But contracts aren't enough in these types of environments. It's the relationships and the forums and the alignment that continues to need lots of effort to be put in place to make sure that we can still keep the building program going and keep the railway running.
So, I can add to that too. We definitely need to have a good relationship with your contractors. The different contracting models shouldn't really determine what sort of conversations and the quality of the conversations you're having. We have a close relationship with all of our contractors, even though we have mostly design and construct contracts. And we've been talking to them for a long time. So I think Peter's right. The quality of the conversation is different, but the conversations are being had. And I think they're being had more frequently. And I think that helps alleviate definitely the risks. We'd love to move to a different type of contracting model. And we're actually looking at our future procurements at the moment. We're finding this is a good time to do these sorts of things because people are more willing to take a bit of a leap rather than just a step forward. And we're working with DTF on that.
Yeah, I'd say never waste a good crisis to critically evaluate how you function and what you do, because it's really important. And I'd say out of this pandemic, the one thing is really clear, that across the spectrum, everyone is committed to making sure that we get through to the other side in the best possible shape, and that we're all heading in the one direction, which is really positive. And I can tell you there's been a lot of barriers and removed, and there's a lot more transparent information flows and communication, which has been really positive, right down through to your subcontractors, right up through to the central agencies and to the ministers, which has been really great, because you do need that level of information sharing to be able to tackle such a pandemic responsibly and appropriately. And it's been really, really great to see that.
So Luke, just maybe carrying on from that point as well, and Richard, I know I'm jumping in a little bit over the top of
Quite
you.
all right.
Interrupt me if you want me to stop too. How do you think that you need to work differently in this environment where you do need to fast track these infrastructure projects at scale? And we've talked about this before, but at the same time be able to achieve those benefits or the economic uplift for the life of the project?
Yeah, so there's a few different parts to that question. I'd say there's dealing with the immediate need to stimulate the economy and get things moving, and getting people out of sort of unemployment situations or underemployment situations. And it's a different sort of mindset for what the government typically does with projects. So you can't employ like a Northeast Link type of a project approach for this type of thing, because that takes multiple years to get up and going. So you won't have that critical mass of people working on it till much further down the line. So you need to think about, well, let's think about more smaller projects. Might be maintenance projects, might be a whole lot of asset management type projects or facilities management type projects, or it might be let's thinking about what type of situation this pandemic has put us in. We're having a need to work a lot more virtually, and thinking about, well, how can digital tools help us to make projects more efficient and deliver them more efficiently. So we're doing a lot in that space, especially extending on from a Victorian digital asset strategy, which is about digital engineering and BIM and those type of processes. So yeah, really needing to think more critically about the projects that we want to put forward, and also think about, well, let's keep on supporting those projects that are already in train.
Yeah, and that builds in. We've just got a little bit of a comment and a question here about how technology shapes that project space. So I'd be interested to hear, Peter and Pella and Richard, what your take is on this fast tracking.
Well, we got 15, I think, new projects in April, right in the middle of the period of pandemic. So we have plenty of work coming in through the pipeline. I think the pipeline is really important, but Luke quite rightly pointed out there's about 15 to 20 other projects that we're currently being asked to look at that we'll need to fast track. Definitely has to be a smaller project. There are inherent risks with doing projects quickly, especially from a scoping perspective and an estimating perspective. I suppose the certainty around the scope and the quantities and the dollars that go with those is something that we need to be really, really, really cognizant of. And we'll need to have some thresholds, if you like, threshold of risk and cost for those items that we can, I suppose, scale up and scale down depending on what we see as costs. My biggest concern will be capacity, skilled capacity that will be required to deliver those projects. There are an awful lot of people who sadly have lost jobs through this process, but whether or not they have the skills, a lot of them will have transferable skills, but whether or not they'll have the right skills will be the biggest question, and how we can deploy them really, really quickly, especially in a virtual space. So training becomes a bit more of a challenge, and the ability for people to execute their skills. The intention is to actually set up people to succeed.
Might share sort of a couple of examples, if you like, just sort of in our world of some sort of things that we've sort of encountered, I suppose, as we've looked to accelerate the delivery of projects. I guess we've been living in a world for the last few years now where we're delivering projects faster than we've ever seen. Probably in certainly my career, I've never seen projects proceeding at the pace we're working at the moment. So it's almost a little daunting at the moment, the concept of can we accelerate it any further, but certainly there's a fair amount of commitment out there to work out what's possible and how much more we can really keep on pushing to deliver a broad range of objectives that we're out to do. I think of a couple of examples from last year where we've been in a very highly accelerated project delivery model. And I think one of both the examples, both have been around configuration change and configuration management. So in our project world, generally we don't get to the final configuration and then turn the railway on. We're generally in lots of small steps to get to the other end. And a lot of the time when you're changing the configuration, it has negative maintenance impacts in the short run or negative operational impacts in the short run until you get to that final end state where the benefit realization really comes in. And then obviously from our perspective, when you're in that sort of negative short run period, it's a challenge, and it requires the industry to work together to work out how do you get the best outcomes overall. So we have one example where a turnout was installed in the track and it needed to do maintenance differently. So we had to say, well, either we don't do that work and wait until we can find a solution, which isn't a bespoke solution to allow the maintenance to be done the same way we've always done it, or do we go ahead, deliver that really large scale program of work and then work out concurrently how do we overcome the maintenance challenges that introduces. Likewise, when we've looked at the operational impacts, another configuration change we made by installing a turnout added an extra 20 seconds of runtime onto a journey on one of our lines. And we had to overcome, well, how do we deal with that? Do we not do that work in the short run because it's going to add the journey time in? Or do we do that work recognizing it has far broader benefits for the state and for our passengers, and then find a way to shave off 20 seconds off the runtime somewhere else so that overall the outcome for the community is the same? So we've been grappling with some of these challenges more and more routinely, I suppose, as we accelerate project delivery more and more over the last probably particularly 2 or 3 years. And I think we're going to see far more of that as we go forward, is how do we meet all of the objectives, even when from the outset they seem like they're competing.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Richard, were you going to say something? I've got a question.
I was going to ask another question, actually. You've all touched on the influx of demand for project delivery. Is this going to fall off a cliff, or there's a question of sustainability about that? So how long are you expecting that to continue, and how do you manage that? Because again, you've spoken of the demands. In practical terms, how do you deal with increased project demand?
And Richard, just on that, before any of the panellists start to think about answering that. We've got a really good question from one of the participants who's asking about these business critical projects that seem to be the only focus at the moment. And the cliff question is really important, because what is happening to prioritisation of other projects? How are they then applied to using different methods or models? That's a big question.
Yeah,
start wherever you like.
Let's start with what's there on the landscape at the moment. And I think at the last budget there was a commitment of around I think we got up to $110 billion worth of projects. And that's before we've had the stimulus packages, and that's before we have add things on like Suburban Rail Loop, which is a massive project in itself, or Melbourne Airport Rail, which is another massive project. So there's all these things that are massively increasing the project pipeline, and I would say stretching it beyond what government has been used to. And you think about, well, if you're stretching it beyond what government's been used to, how does that fit with the sort of capacity and capability aspect as well? So that is also being stretched right across the whole spectrum, from government right through to contractors, through to players like MTM as well. And it is a big concern for government. As we add on more projects, how do we keep them going and getting the same quality and standard of delivery, and making sure that our project controls are in place, and we have that discipline to be able to deliver what we promised, when we promised it, for the amount that we promised it for, because $110 billion is a lot of money, and that just keeps on growing. And I know in government, we've been having more of a focus, a switch from having pockets of excellence to let's see how we can bring the whole government up to a certain level of excellence. So really focused on bringing like procedural requirements, consistent processes across government and systems to support that. So not every department is the same level of maturity as, say, Pelagia's department. There is gaps all across, and we need to make sure that we're fitting in those gaps are and prioritising the best need for government, because you can't address everything overnight, but you should be focusing on where your biggest risks are and where your biggest risk exposure is. And so we're doing a whole lot of work to be able to address that, and it's from looking at the skills we need and rolling out programs to address that. And so, for instance, government is rolling out a leadership academy for projects, Australian Major Projects Leadership Academy. Pella and I are on that at the moment, and we're also doing commercial capability training, but we also need really experienced graduates or graduates that have the right skills that are coming into the mix as well. So it's the whole spectrum, and making sure that we're building up that pipeline of people with the pipeline of projects to be able to tackle it. And I haven't even talked about all the resourcing constraints like aggregate or material or steel or things like that. So that's also a big challenge.
And we have quite a complex model that we're putting into play for our projects, and the whole of MTIA, the Major Transport Infrastructure Authority, is actually, each of us are talking to each other about what we're going to do, and we're collaborating between each other about the resources and what we're going to need outside, because we all use pretty much the same sort of contractors. However, our future procurement model is also looking at the smaller contractors now. So we're actually trying to split the work up into more different types of packages, so that we can actually deploy them as low down as possible, so that we can actually utilise the skills that are available. The other thing we're trying to do is talk to the vet industry and talking about, apprenticeships, internships, cadetships, all sorts of things. And yes, it is a big question. And if you had a crystal ball, it can tell you whether or not we're going to fall off the cliff. But I'd like to think that we've got quite a good, resilient, adaptable environment, and people want to do the right thing. So I think we should be okay. But I also know that a lot of people are coming to Victoria just because we've got such an influx of projects, and they can see it as a huge opportunity for them as well to have a wonderful lifestyle and be able to contribute to our economy and to our infrastructure. So I think there are lots of positives, but there's an awful lot of work that's being done across government to do this.
Yeah, look, I might add as well, certainly from our perspective, on the resourcing front, that's something we think a lot about all the time. One of the things that's really important for us is when we're thinking about resources and the risk of the cliff at some point in the future versus making sure we've got the right capability in place to deliver the work that has to be done, we need to make sure that we invest in a responsible way in the right resources and that we're efficient about it, so that we're seen to make sure that we're delivering a good value resource profile, so that then the temptation to reduce transport funding in the future never sort of starts to get into the conversation in the wider sphere. So the kinds of things that we talk a lot about, to deliver major projects, we need to invest a lot in train drivers. That becomes a critical constraint for us, because each time we alter the railway with a major project, we have to train a lot of people to do things differently, and that needs a lot of downtime for those drivers. So one of the big sort of changes we made over the last year is introducing VR into driver training. So rather than drivers, for the more simple changes on our network, having to be off an entire shift and having to run the route to learn how the signals work, a lot of those simple training activities they can do now through a classroom approach, and it can take as little as half an hour or an hour to learn the route now, and then they can carry on driving a train on a revenue service for the remainder of the period. So what that allows us to do is, when we're starting to think about those risks of at some point, if the investment sort of cycle ends, we don't want to have then hundreds of surplus drivers that are only there to enable a major project to be done. So this allows us to manage those risks where we have a smaller number of additional people in place, and it allows then good decisions to be made around the longevity of that program, so we can do it as efficiently as possible, and hopefully it goes on for many years to come, Luke.
Yeah, let's hope. There's a big infrastructure need, and the government's committed to meeting some of that need. But yeah, more infrastructure spending is required.
Yep, and just on that, we've got another question from one of the participants that's talking about how are you actually managing the projects in comparison to what happened before the pandemic, and what are the challenges in how you're monitoring those projects?
I don't see too much change other than everything's done virtually. We're still monitoring them daily. We have people on the ground. We've got people in the offices, of course, not as many. We've got special procedures when we are going out on site. I still get reports every second day on what's happening. What am I going to do in the future? Well, I have a new tool that I'm going to be deploying very, very soon that will have everything done virtually anyway. And that's the beauty. I think Luke correctly pointed out, now that we're in a crisis, everything seems to get unblocked, and we can do stuff that we never thought we would be able to do in the past, which is great. We're looking at common systems. Government is already upgrading its enterprise resource planning tools anyway, so that's being accelerated as much as possible. I suppose what I'm trying to say is the amount of work we're doing whilst we're in a pandemic has not diminished. It has continued to grow, and it has continued to provide some interesting challenges. However, nothing has stopped. We're continuing to deliver projects. We're continuing to deliver the monitoring required to deliver those projects, and we're continuing to deliver for Victoria. So we finished a new road yesterday. So Drysdale was opened yesterday. So as you can see, nothing has really changed.
I think we're having a similar experience on rail projects, Pella. Is a lot of it is business as usual in terms of the actual project delivery element of it. One of the sort of things that we talk a lot about certainly over the last year, while we've been delivering so much in the project space, is our passenger fatigue for disruption. So there's only so much that you can disrupt people before, no matter how good the benefits are at the end, before people get really a bit fed up with it. So we've been disrupting people a lot, and it's for good reason. It's delivering good outcomes in the long run, but people do get fatigued from that sort of period of time. The one thing that's changed for us is there's a lot less people on trains at the moment than what there were at the beginning of the pandemic. So we've had a good hard look at what work can we do, and is it possible to do more work during this period than what we were doing before? Because it leads to less passenger disruption because people are staying at home. So we're really looking at certainly the last couple of months, but the next 6 months ahead, while there's potentially reduced patronage on our services, can we do more work and disrupt less people during that period? So it's a question we're really grappling with at the moment, working out what's possible.
We're not so lucky.
Yeah,
more people are on the roads for me. So simply because they are in isolation. They want a social distance. That's great. So I've got a lot more people on the road than I would have normally had in a pandemic, even though most people are working from home still. So we've put in our normal risk frameworks from a safety perspective. I think people will notice that the barriers are up on the Monash freeway for stage 2. So work hasn't diminished at all. And we're going to do the best that we can to deliver as soon as possible with the timeframes we've got. And if we can accelerate stuff to do them faster, simply because we're more efficient and more effective, then that's what we'll do. The intention is not, though, to increase the cost to the state. So we're very, very, very aware of that. So that's what we're trying to do. Luke?
Yeah, I would just echo what you're saying, Pella. It really takes a crisis to highlight the sort of vulnerabilities and key areas for where you can really modernise, because a lot of people, well, government's been focused on getting projects done, but now there's also this focus on how do we get it done better, especially thinking about a virtual environment. So upgrading systems is really important, and also the capability. So for instance, in our group, we just more recently had the chief economist from the UK's Treasury come across and join our team, and he's got some great examples of portfolio oversight and reporting work that he's got, and yeah, it's just amazing. So I think we're going to get a lot better in that space, and government's going to be a lot more on the front foot with everything that we're doing. So I would say it's good to have that level of transparency right across the government and that information flow, and I think it'll really help with understanding where are the risk points and where does the government need to pay closer attention to certain things, and where can it back off as well and just let things happen.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. I wanted to touch on a little bit more of the question that was asked and ask this of Richard, and then bring it back, because everybody's touched on the development of skills and capabilities in this different dynamic and complex environment. And Luke, you talked about the program that's been run out of the Office of Projects Victoria. The question, though, is that we may be seeing slightly different projects emerging that were unplanned. So how do we prioritise not only the projects, and Richard, this is over to you as a chief examiner at Monash, and how do you actually then develop up the skills? And I know, Pella, you talked about that. So maybe if Richard, you could kick off with that type of dilemma that we're dealing with.
I'll pick up on, I think both Pella and Luke touched on this earlier. I've got to say, though, that, I mean, even though we're, like Chivonne and I are sitting in an academic environment, when we look at how industry is dealing with projects and doing our best to try to resource industry with the right personnel to deliver on that. Look, to be honest, the academic world, the universities in Australia haven't really turned their minds to this all that specifically until very recently. Comparatively recently, it's programs like Chivonne's that focuses exclusively on project management or project leadership that are starting now to bring again, very specific, very structured skill sets into this environment. previously we relied on, you know, a very generic undergraduate education really coming out of generic business fields. And then we tried to sort of mould them into people somehow on the job, mind you, on the job, that could go and deliver something, something of a project that may or may not have stemmed from their undergraduate training. You know, it's kind of hit and miss at best, I think, really hit and miss at best. So I think, the academic world has something to answer for there, and slowly it is stepping up to it. We are finding more and more that, and it's not just Monash, but universities are turning a corner and now realising that industry is making a very reasonable demand of the academic world in terms of resourcing them for project delivery. So I think really it starts with education, starts with academic backgrounds and academic resourcing. Once you have that, you have, I guess, a cornerstone from which to work. It's not going to be just an academic education that's going to, you know, give you good project delivery outcomes, but it's a damn good start. It's a damn good start. Without that, I think we're back to where we were, say, 5 or 10 years ago, where we were just relying on this generic undergraduate education to somehow deliver fantastic projects that people really weren't trained to know how to deliver.
Mm.
Richard, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I'm a Monash grad, right? So
congratulations, Pella.
Twice over too. So there's the first issue. So the next one was, we're in our office, we're really focused on that. I have interns, I have graduate intakes, I have work experience intakes. I have usually got 2 grads and an EPIC grad usually through my office every 2 months. So they learn the fundamentals. However, I have to say to every single one of my graduates, you cannot come back and become a specialist in project controls unless you've been exposed to all the other different roles in a project. If you can master those on your way, there's not going to be an issue with you moving forward. But if you cannot master everything, then maybe project management isn't your field. Maybe you need to be an engineering manager. Maybe you need to be a commercial manager. Maybe you need to be a strategic comms person. It really helps you define whether or not you should specialize. A project manager has to be a control freak, first and foremost. Secondly, they need to know and remember everything that's going on at once. If you cannot master that multi-skilling, multitasking, multi-everything as a PM, you really haven't got the grit for it. And it is a grit requirement. I mean, I think my first job out of Monash was in the Navy, in a shipyard, in a very heavy steel working environment. It's highly unionized. And boy, did I learn a lot. And you can't learn that in a classroom.
There's certainly something to be said for work integrated learning, whether it's specifically on projects or even just in general. And again, it really is only in the last 20, 25 years that universities have started taking that seriously and have started resourcing their work integrated learning programs, some better than others. But I think the important thing here is that it's sort of coming off what you were saying there, Pella, that I think if students have the opportunity to get into industry in the very early stages of their careers, whilst they've got a safety net and whilst they're even still completing their undergraduate education, they've got an opportunity there to try to, again, from what you're saying, Pella, they've got an opportunity to try to work out whether something is really for them or not. And it gives both them and future employers a bit of a walk-up start. It's not leaving it just up to the employer to help them figure that out. It's getting the student to start thinking for themselves very early about what they want from their careers, what they think they can add to a career for themselves rather than simply drawing it from everybody else. And indeed, what they can contribute to a future employer. It's going to give them, you know, what we hear from people going through work integrated learning programs, whether it's placements or projects, is that they feel far more value in themselves once they've come out of it, simply because they know they've got something to contribute. And the ones that don't feel that way know they weren't in the right place and they might want to go and try something different. And we now find, especially over the last 5 or 6 years, we find students doing more than one work integrated learning project or placement, just simply work it out. And, you know, hopefully then it makes it a little bit easier, obviously on the student, the future employee, but also the future employer, if they've got someone that kind of has at least notionally an idea of, you know, where their place might be.
I think it's really important, well, this discussion is being had right now, but it's really important to support the development of students and early career and middle career right the way through. I think we've had over 21 interns in 2 years. We've got 2 graduates at the moment. And I would wholeheartedly support about Pella's comment. You need to go and test different areas of a project, work out what fits your style or your work ethic, but also work in different industries and apply the different learnings from different industries, because that's really important. I don't think it's in this day and age you can spend your whole career in one industry. It's really important to work between industries and gather those learnings. I mean, some of these projects that we have in government are the size, I mean, $6 billion, $20 billion, $50 billion projects. They're like massive startups. And it needs to have that, you need to have some really specialized skill sets just to help support that. And project managers, they need to know how to manage that and bring the best out of all those skill sets.
Oh, look, I would totally agree with what both of you just sort of said on that as well. Is I think the best project managers that we work with are the ones who got a decent breadth of experience before they really mature into more senior roles. So I think until you've had a chance to kick the tires out on site and understand different elements in the office of how that works and start to understand how the bigger picture works, taking the time to get that breadth before you sort of launch too far ahead is a really important element of where I see the best project managers. One of the skills that we're sort of seeing is a really, I think it's always been a skill and a requirement, but we're sort of seeing it emerging as a more important part of it. Certainly over the last year or two is knowing how to manage interfaces. Just some of the projects that are being delivered at the moment just have some of the most complex interfaces I've ever seen when you start pulling together the different components of them. And knowing how to manage those and the kinds of things to look out for and the processes to work through to get to the right outcomes in those spaces, I just think have become more important than ever before. And I think the people who've got that grounding and that breadth of experience from the beginning are able to succeed well in those problems. The people who don't necessarily have that same breadth find it much more challenging, and the outcomes tend to be things that are forgotten or miscalculated, which lead to some pretty interesting outcomes a little bit further down the road.
Yeah, there's a real skill and art of simplifying the complex.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Lou. And Peter, what I'll do is I'll just close off now. We're 1 minute away, or maybe 40 seconds away from the end, 1:15. Thanks again, Pella, Luke, Peter, Richard, and the audience for participating and joining in. There is a link to a recording that will be emailed out to everybody in a little while, and enjoy the rest of your day. So thank you.